Hi guys, welcome to part 8 of my particles course. Today I want to create surface particles again, as we did in all the lessons, but this time I want to animate the geometry and stick the simulated particles to the animated geometry. And let's see how this works. So to quickly generate a particle system that creates particles that slide on the surface of an object, lay down a torus this time. And we want to up the resolution of the torus. So let's dive inside and up this by typing 12 times 10 and 24 times 10 to give it a lot more resolution, like so. Let me switch to primitives here to get rid of the point display. And now I want to scatter some points, but before I do so, let's lay down a point VOP to set some density value for the scatter swap to use. So let's call this set density and dive inside. Inside I want to use an anti-alias noise, as I do always, connect it to P to sample some noise values and then append a fit node to fit the range, the output range of the noise from minus 0.5 to 0.5 to the new range of 0 to 1. Now that the range is normalized, we can append a ramp. So let's append a ramp parameter and call this ramp noise. And let's make this a spline ramp. And let's connect the output to CD for now to see something. Everything turns black because this ramp defaults to 0, but if I go up here, you see we are getting some nice noise. Let me get rid of the wireframe by pressing Shift W. And now let's make this a little sharper by moving these knots closer together. But I don't want black and white noise, so let's create another ramp parameter. Let's call this one ramp color, say, and let's wire the output of the first ramp into the input of the second ramp, and let's connect the second ramp's output to CD. And now I have this ramp color here that I can use to color my object and thus the scattered points. Let's put a gradient in here. Say we start with something red, orangish. Then on the other side we put a nice blue and maybe in the middle something greenish, like so. Now that I have that, I can use the color value to scatter my points, but maybe I want to change the color later and then the scattering will change. So it's good practice to put a bind export here and bind the output of this first noise, so the value basically, before coloring it, to an attribute that I will use in the scatter node, and the default is density. So I use density here to save some work. And now we can append a scatter. Append it here, make it visible, and it will scatter some points. To see them better, let's press D, and let's switch the background to dark, like so. So now we have uniformly scattered points. First turn off relax iterations, and then turn on the density attribute. And now it's taking this density attribute into account, and it's only scattering particles where the density is high. That is what we want. And we need more particles, so we could force the total count, but instead let's just up the density scale to 2000, say, and now we have some points here on our torus. Maybe revisit this set density quickly and make this even more sparse, like so, because I plan on emitting from here, and I don't want the particle system to get too dense too quickly. Now that we have these points, let's put down a pop network, connect these points to the pop network. And let's make our surface effect. So let's dive into the popnet, visit the pop source, turn off the guide, and set the emission type to all points. Now our points are coming in. To move these points around, I want to drop a pop force, and I want to connect it here to affect all particles. And let's dial the amplitude to 0.3, say, and let's quickly simulate to see what this gives. Nice, the particles are emitting more particles, and these are driven by this curl noise field that comes with the pop force. And now I want to restrict them to the surface. I want to constrain them to the surface. We did this before, so let's go one level up and let's put this torus into the second input of the popnet. That is not necessary, but I prefer to do it like this because then later on I easily can see what's going on here. So inside of the popnet we want to lay down a pop warp to do the constraint. So create a pop warp, connect it after the pop force, make sure it's connected and call it project to surface. And let's dive inside. Oh, wait, before we do this, let's go to the input tab and let's set the inputs correctly because I plan on using the geometry that is coming into the pop network on port 2. So I have to set this here. I set input 2 of this VOP to the second context geometry of the pop network. So now we can dive inside. And I want to use XYZ dist. This node finds the parametric coordinate of the closest point on the surface of the mesh. So it's not looking for the points of the other mesh, but it is looking for the location inside of the primitives of the mesh. So the mesh to look up is coming in over input 2. So let's connect input 2, not 3, input 2 here, and not to group, always the same. Our input 2 to input. So XYZ dist is searching the torus now, and the position to search is the particle position. Now this node does not give me P, but it gives me a primitive number and a prim UV vector, and that is parametric coordinates. So the primitive number is the primitive of the torus that contains the closest point, and this prim UV vector is telling me where inside of this primitive the point lives. What I can do now is I can lay down a primitive attribute node and connect the primitive to primitive and the prim UV to UV, and of course the torus to file. And now I can use this to read attributes that exist at exactly this location. It defaults to CD, we change this to P, and we connect this P to P. And let's see what that gives. And now, as before, the particles are trailing along the surface of this torus. So this is our surface effect. Now let's go up and up again to our geometry network, and let's animate the torus. Make the torus visible, and let's append a transform. Here, make the transform visible, and let's go to frame 1 and set a keyframe on translate and rotate. Zoom out a bit, and then let's go to frame 120, say, or maybe 240. And now let's move the torus over on Z quite a bit, like so, and key the translate, and let's rotate this torus in 2 axes like so. Let's see what this gives. Well, a little more rotation might be nice. Key this, and we have a tumbling torus. Cool. So how can we now put our statically simulated particles on this moving torus? Well, basically using exactly the same technique that we are using to project the particles to the surface of the torus. We are using the parametric coordinates. And to use them after the simulation, we have to store them on the points. So go down to our project to surface VOP and lay down a bind export. And this first bind export will export the primitive that is found. So connect it here, switch the type to integer, because this is an integer value, and call it myPrim. So each point is now storing the primitive that contains the closest point. And now a second bind export of type vector, and we call this myPrimUV, and we connect the found PrimUV. So now if I press play and go to the geometry spreadsheet, then to the pop object and to geometry, we see, let me make everything invisible and just make myPrim visible. that is the prim containing the closest point, and my prim UV is the location inside of this primitive. Very good. So if we now go up, we have this on the particles. So if you middle click here, you see my prim UV and my prim. So now we can lay down another warp, point warp, to make these particles move with the animated object. So let's rename this to move simulated points. Points, like so. And let's connect the points to the first input and our animated torus to the second input. Make it visible and dive inside. And in here, we do the same thing as with the constraint, with the surface constraint. It's just that we now bind first the integer value called my prim that we saved earlier, and then we bind the vector value, my prim UV, like so. And now we have all the information to use the primitive attribute node here outside of the simulation, because now we can connect the animated torus to this prim UV, my prim to prim, my prim UV to UV, and don't forget to change CD to P. And now let's connect this output to P. And what you find, let me make this torus, if I template it, you see that now the simulated points are moving with the animated torus. And that is reasonable because they are using the prim UV attributes that I stored, and they don't change because the geometry or the topology of the torus does not change. So that means that these points are just transformed to their location on the torus while they are simulated. So this way we can simulate in the world origin and then transform the points to this moving torus. Like so. Simulated points, post moved to the torus. But I don't want to stop here. We can do more with these stored intrinsic or parametric attributes. I want that points to leave the torus as soon as they are older than 2 seconds. So they are moving on the surface of the torus, and then they should leave the torus and be simulated. And I can do this by appending a second simulation. So create another pop network. And this pop network wants to create the same particles that we had in our first simulation. So we want to use the same input points that we used for our first popnet. But then we need more information here. First, we need the torus that is moving, put it to input 3, and we need the simulated particles from our first simulation, put them to input 2. Now this popnet is set up. Make it visible and dive inside. We want to set our source exactly as we did in the first one, so set this to all points and turn off guide. And thus this will give simulated points, or this will create points. And now we want to apply a little bit of pop force to make them move. Let's up the amplitude to 0.1 and let's apply some drag, pop drag after that, like so. So if we press play now, we get particles that are moving with curl noise again. Okay. But we only want to do this to the particles as soon as they are older than 2 seconds. So let's create a new stream by using a pop stream node and attach this to the source. And let's write a expression here to create our stream. This expression reads if at age is smaller than 2, in group is 1. As long as the particles are younger than 2 seconds, they will be in this stream. That means we can use this stream to override the pop force and pop drag behavior. First, let's connect this here to wire pops into here to make it execute. And now we can lay down another pop warp to move the particles with a torus. So call this move with torus. And let's dive inside. And inside, we want to read the position values from the particles from the first simulation. And we can do this by using an import point attribute node. This wants a file, so let's give it the points from the first simulation that are coming in over op input 2. Oh, by the way, they are not coming in over op input 2 because I have to set the inputs to second context geometry here. And now we can just use ptnum to connect it to ptnum. Because we are emitting exactly the same particles as with the first simulation, the point numbers are the same. So ptnum finds the corresponding point from the first simulation. And now we import p and set this to p. And as soon as we do this, what we get is the particles are sticking to the surface of the torus, and as soon as they are older than 2 seconds, they are leaving our torus and they are simulated with noise, like so. That is nice. And the new particles are not emitted, but they are really just sticking to the surface of the torus, or to the point of the other simulation, until the condition is met, and then they are leaving the surface. And to make this look a little bit nicer, let's import the velocity from the other points and from the torus and set the velocity here. So let's create another WOP, pop WOP, and let's put it here between the pop stream and the move's torus and call it getV. And let's set it up by second and third context geometry being input 2 and 3. And I plan on importing the velocity of the torus at the closest location and the velocity of the particles. The problem is the animated torus does not have any velocity. To compute velocity, we can just create a trail SOP and append this trail SOP here. And let's go to the trail SOP and set it to compute velocity. What this will do is, if we turn on velocity vectors, make this move, you see that we now have velocities on this torus that we can now read inside of our popnet. Dive into our popnet again and to the getV. So there is two things we want to get here. We want to get the velocities from the torus, and we want to get the velocities of the particles from the first simulation, so the velocities along the surface. To get the velocity from the torus, we need the myPrim and myPrimUV attributes. But these are not on these particles yet. They are still on the particles from the first simulation. So this is a little bit of a convoluted setup, but bear with me. You will understand what I'm doing. So I'm using an import point attribute, and I connect this to op input 2, because this is where the particles are coming in. And I connect ptnum to ptnum. And I'm importing an integer called myPrim. So I'm just fetching the myPrim attribute from the first simulation. Now let's duplicate this import point, set it to vector 3, and import myPrimUV. So now I'm reading these two attributes from the original simulated particles that have the same ptnum as these particles, and now I can use these attributes to create another primitive attribute node that now reads from the animated torus. So now I'm connecting the geometry of op input 3, and I'm connecting the result of myPrim to prim, and myPrimUV will go to UV, like so. And now I want to read V, the velocity vector. And if I now set this to V, I'm importing the velocity vector, and let's see what this gives. And you see, now they are not just sticking in the air as soon as they leave, but they are picking up the velocity of the torus. And that is already a little bit more organic than it used to be. And now let's mix in the velocity of the particles along the surface. to do this, I need a third import point. That's the vector again, and that is just v, the velocity of the points. Now I can add the velocity from the torus and the velocity from the simulated points of system 1 and put this into v. And let's see what this does. And now they are inheriting the velocity of the points before, as you can see, as soon as they leave the torus. This imported velocity here is maybe a little strong, so let's put a multiply constant here and dial this down to 0.5 like so. And maybe let's go up to the scatter and go a little bit down with the point density to 1000. And let's see what this simulation is doing for us. Okay, now we have points that are traveling simulated on the surface. And as soon as they get old, they are leaving the surface. They inherit the velocity of the animated torus and of the original simulation. And then they are simulated again in this second popnet, like so. Nice little creature that we created here. Great, and that concludes the tutorial that deals with prim UV and parametric coordinates. So, now that we created this, let's quickly render this in Mantra. Rendering particles in Mantra is really straightforward. The very first thing that we need is a light. So make the shelf visible and click on Area Light. That places an area light into the scene. And if I zoom out, here is my area light. I move this in front of my trail, somewhere around here, say, and make it point to our particles. And go to the area light and up the area size to 2 by 2, like so. Now we can create a camera. So light, camera, and let's press this lock to position the camera, and let's switch to the render view and press render. Wait a second, the scene is generated. And we get very large particles. But where do they come from? We never instanced anything on the particles. Well, they are created on render time by Mantra. If you go to the torus and then to render, you find this geometry tab here, and that is by default set to render as points, render unconnected points. And that means points that are not connected to a primitive will render, and they will render as spheres. That is the second drop-down. So Mantra creates these spheres on render time, picks up the color, and puts these spheres on the points directly, without anything you have to do. The only thing that you can do, of course, is to set p-scale to make them a little smaller, because they are really large at the moment. So let's stop the render quickly, and after the second popnet, just depend a wrangle, point wrangle, call it set p-scale. Set underscore p scale, like so, and in here we write at p scale is 0.04, and of course we have to make p scale visible, otherwise it won't have any effect. So let's re-render again. Still a little large, so let's go down to 0.01, and now they are smaller. 0.02. Ah, that's nice. Well, it is quite dark, this render. Let me make the viewport a little bigger. And let's go up. And let's see. Maybe let's add an environment light. So let's stop the render for now and go to the shelf and press environment light. And if we render now, we get an area light that is surrounding the entire scene and projecting light from all directions on our particles, making them lighter, like so. That looks better. And if you want, you can now go to your matte network and just put down a principled shader. Principled shader, let's call this particles, and let's apply it. If we go to OBJ again, and then to our torus, we can apply this material. Here it is. And now let's re-render, and we should get a little reflection on our spheres, because it's now using a proper PBR shader instead of this default shader. But this reflection, of course, makes things slower. So we can go to Materials again, and then to the Principled shader, and turn the reflection off by just going to Reflection, and then dialing down the reflectivity slider here to 0, then the reflection goes away. And maybe you ask yourself where the color is coming from. Well, the principled shader is programmed in a way that it picks up CD automatically as long as this use point color is on, and it is on by default. So Houdini makes it really easy to render spherical particles by default. Okay, so that is already nice. So let's go to Out now. And we already have a mantra node here, the mantra IPR. We can use this, and if we go to rendering, you will find the pixel samples, and that is the overall quality. So that is the number of eye rays or primary rays that mantra shoots for every pixel to calculate the color of the shading point. If we increase this number, the quality will go up. So let's go to 4x4, just create 16 rays instead of 9 per pixel to get rid of the grain. And these, if you turn on ray variant and de-aliasing, then you get these min ray sample and max ray sample values, and these are in charge of controlling the secondary rays. So first mantra shoots a ray to the shading point, and then this point generates new rays that go out into the scene and look for reflections and lights and all the secondary effects. And you can control how many of these rays are sent by using the min and max samples. And it works like this. Mantra shoots one secondary ray, always, and then it compares the result that this ray gives with the noise level. So the variance is compared to the noise level. And if it is larger than the noise level, then more rays are sent until the noise level is met. So by decreasing the noise level to 0.001, for example, more rays are sent and the noise will vanish faster. By the way, if you click into the render view and just move your mouse, then you will target all your buckets to this area and it clears faster. And this already looks quite okay. I'd say let's go to OBJ again and increase the intensity of the area light. That was a little strong, like so, to give a clearer reading to the light and shadow areas. And that is very basic spherical particle rendering in Mantra. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Using parametric coordinates is a very powerful technique. You can use it for a lot of things. So see you next time with part 9 of the particle course.